Hey, listen, I recommend that you take a moment of pause here. This might not go over well in the future. This could be a really bad idea. Time out, time out. Take a minute to think about what you're doing. Welcome to Briefing. Whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, at some point you have probably heard about the story of Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana. But there's a significant problem with this story that isn't really talked about from the pulpit, and most people don't know about it. If police officers were to read this story, they would probably pick it out very, very quickly. Okay, take a few minutes to think like a cop. Put this video on pause and read through the story of Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana. See if you can spot what it is that I find problematic with this story. Did you catch that problem? I've spent 37 years in law enforcement. First as a patrol officer, working my way up to detective and then into the supervisory ranks. When I read this story, the problem jumps out at the page at me. Did you spot it? This is the exact topic for today's briefing training. The problem starts in verse 9 and is solidified in verse 10. Jesus is serving and creating wine for people who are already impaired by alcohol, at least to the point where they can't tell the difference between a good quality wine and a cheap quality wine. That's alcohol impairment, and it leads to problems. I have personally been to wedding receptions that turned into melees. Grooms left angry and upset as they try and console their new bride who is in shock and in tears. Responding police officers sometimes have conflict with other partygoers that have also been drinking too much. And all of this because someone didn't have the common sense and judgment not to provide more alcohol for people who were already impaired by alcohol, which in this particular story is the exact behavior that Jesus is modeling. So I was having a conversation with a couple of professional Catholic apologists, people who are paid to defend the Catholic faith. Both of them accused me of being a teetotaler, the enemy of fun, somebody who wanted to ruin the party by removing all the alcohol in the first place. Some of you watching this video are probably thinking the exact same thing. But what I want to make as an important point is that Christian people have a variety of beliefs on the use of alcohol depending on how they personally interpret Scripture. Some Christians think that drinking beer, wine, and cocktails is perfectly acceptable in social settings. Other Christians believe that just the mere drinking of alcohol alone is sinful behavior. If you like your drinking and you want to be a Christian, I would not recommend that you become a senior soldier in the Salvation Army. I would recommend that you give a real consideration to Catholicism. Jesus is depicted as a divine character, as God himself. He's depicted as being able to raise people from the dead, Jairus' daughter from the dead, the widow's son in Nain from the dead, Lazarus from the dead. He's depicted as being able to cure blind people and give them sight, as being able to take the disabled and cure them so that they can walk again. Jesus is depicted as having predicted the destruction of the Jerusalem temple 40 years before it was actually destroyed by the Romans. Yet in this particular story, Jesus doesn't seem to understand that serving an alcoholic beverage to people who are already impaired by alcohol leads to further impairment and drunkenness, which creates problems and a lot of suffering that society's gone through, as well as sinful behavior. An ancient author would have had a good idea some of the problems associated with alcohol abuse. They would have seen drunk people who drink all day laying in the streets and doing nothing, looking disheveled, having poor health. They would have also known that people who drink too much at a certain time might be more inclined to get into some kind of fight, fall down, have accidents. They did not have the same knowledge that we do today. We have expert witnesses who testify in court in drunken driving cases. We have people who have dedicated their lives to studying alcohol abuse and how to help those who are addicted to alcohol. We have an enormous amount more knowledge today than they would have had in the first century when these books were written. Alcohol can contribute to all kinds of societal problems. domestic violence, child abuse, crime. Sometimes you go out for a hard night of partying and you wake up the next morning and there's a naked person in your bed. And you're looking over at that person thinking, I have no idea who this person is. Defenders of the Christian faith love to use slippery slope arguments when it suits their purpose. For example, if children are allowed to practice yoga, it might lead to them worshiping false gods in the future. If we have marriage equality in the United States, it might lead to people having child brides or marrying farm animals. Removing prayer from public schools has led to mass shootings in public schools. These are the common slippery slope arguments that I've heard from Christian defenders of the faith that they've used. It seems to me, though, that there's a different standard when it's a slippery slope argument involving Jesus. Jesus is creating wine for people who are already impaired by wine. Could that then lead to sinful behavior in the next hour or so as they become more and more intoxicated? Another thing that defenders of the faith will use when you bring these topics up for consideration is a whole host of non sequiturs. Non sequiturs being something that actually doesn't address the thing that we're talking about or the claim being made and addresses something completely different than that.
Foolish or irresponsible any more than all the good food that was there. Let's say that Jesus had decided to make a whole lot more food. Well, chances are there were people who might have gorged on the food to the point of gluttony and perhaps even have harmed their health, but that's a risk that you run when you're dealing with a good thing like food or drink.
Look it, I have never been to a wedding reception or seen an incident where eating too many mashed potatoes caused a couple of guys to get into a fisticuffs with one another that led to a brawl. But I've seen that a lot of different times with alcohol use. This story in the Gospel of John is designed to introduce Jesus' divinity, to introduce him as a miracle worker. But because of first century ignorance, the author actually mistakenly introduces Jesus as irresponsible and unaware of the dangers of alcohol impairment. Look it, I'm not trying to lecture you about alcohol use. It is dangerous though, and there's a lot of reasons you need to be careful. It would be my advice to you, based on my law enforcement experience, that if you're going to go out for a night of drinking, that you take Uber. You bring some really trustworthy, sober friends along with you to kind of guide you through the evening, and be careful. All right, stay safe.